you, Dr. Tini Goswami. Uh, Now I welcome our next speaker, Dr. Tini Goswami, to present her paper. Dr. Tini Goswami has done her master's and PhD from Jagannath University, and her thesis has been published in 2011 from New Delhi. She has numerous national and international publications and toured Europe and other European countries to present her research papers. She was a JRF in Indian Council of Historical Research from 2006 to 2008 and a fellow of the Asiatic Society from 2010 to 2013. Dr. Goswami was a UGC Research Associate at Women's Studies Research Center, University of Calcutta from 2013 to 2014. Presently, she is an assistant professor and the HOD of History, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, Raghabpur campus. She is also working as a part-time faculty of the postgraduate department of Jadavpur University. Her areas of research are history of gender, culture and regional history, history of science, technology and religions, history of public health, and history of education in West Bengal. Now I welcome Dr. Goswami to start with your presentation. Dr. Goswami, please.
Thank you, Dr. Srijani, for introducing me. I would like to thank uh, my department and also IQAC, and also to all those who are present here. And without the blessings of our Father Principal and Father Vice Principal, we won't be able to have this program. And thanks to all of you, and hope our participants will be surely benefited from this FDP, and we will be trying our level best to help everyone and also to satisfy your academic queries. So my presentation is based on medical history, and the title of my presentation is Situating Various Trends of Interpreting Medical Literature in the Context of Colonial Bengal, a Critical Approach to Deconstruct Social History. It is difficult to define the scope of literature, as it is as vast like an ocean. The term medical literature does not limit our understanding with regard of medical terminologies. Rather, if a literature states something relevant in terms of health and medicine, can be considered as medical literature. I have chosen some of the important vernacular health journals of the colonial period and the other writings for this lecture, or to initiate a specific discourse. There are certain questions in my mind to validate my arguments or the hypothesis. These are such as: how can we reconstruct or deconstruct the social history of colonial Bengal in terms of vernacular health journals? Secondly, what should be the ways or approaches to revisit those days? Here, the research methodology which I have followed is based on certain theories related to the philosophy of history, and I dealt with the facts which are not the mere narrations of the past, as this area is widely explored or exhausted. If I would like to begin with my knowing of the medical history, then we'll definitely quote Collingwood, who once stated, I quote, "Historian is interested in the social customs which they create by their thought as a framework. Within these appetites find satisfaction in ways sanctioned by convention, and morality. Unquote. In the history of science and medicine, especially in the sphere of public health, we find various opinions leading to different discourses and debates, emphasizing the intricacies of human minds, how a diseased nation can transform the mindset of the people is very much pertinent if we think of the present COVID 19 situation. Similarly, the health journals of the colonial times in Bengal signified the mental and physical agony of the natives and the colonial apathy of introducing necessary reforms, which indicate towards a state of despair embedded in negativity. It was a situation which did not reflect any hope, and the future was also uncertain. The writings were full of substantial thoughts, as sufferings of the natives were eternal. For example, in her article on malaria in Bengal, Prabhavati Devi Saraswati depicted how the poor people during that time never got escaped from the clutches of the mentioned ailment. In Mitra Prakash, one of the journals which was circulated from Dhaka, an article was published in 1872 on the book review of Kavita Manjuri, a collection of poems by Srimati Basanta Kumari. She was the wife of a landlord and had already earned fame as a poet. During her prolonged illness, she wrote many soulful poems which were later compiled in Kavita Manjuri. From this piece of literature, it is evident that in colonial Bengal, the health services were unsatisfactory, irrespective of the social status of the people. It was a time when not so famous poet Lokkhimoni, in her poem on Bardwan fever, murmured the unsung stories of those who lost their near and dear ones in Bardwan fever, and this poem is soulful as it was based on experiencing the grey shades of life sunk in the reality. Nowadays, most of the researches have an interdisciplinary nature, and from that perspective, it can be said that history of medicine or public health is also an integral component of the investigations on social sciences. Here one can mention about the theory of positivism by Auguste Comte. As we know, Koth emphasized on real life experiences and facts. On the other, through the law of three stages, he stated that to describe the development of social progress, the positive stage or the modern stage is utmost important. Here we would like to justify the theme of the lecture in the light of Coates' argument. Then it is evident that the presence of perceptible public opinion represents a subjective discourse based on human emotions. On the contrary, history also seeks objectivity or information. The above mentioned literary examples reflect harsh realities and contribute towards the formation of the discourse on public health with an insight of embracing humanist historiography. In my opinion, it is important to expose how the colonial culture propagated a subtle notion of subjugation of the native minds through the tools of knowledge or wisdom. As for example, Edward said while discussing the discourse on colonialism, gave emphasis on the imperial interests of the colonizers, where culture played the role of a metaphor. He stated, I quote, I think one of the main flaws in the enormous literature in economics and political science and history about imperialism is that very little attention has been paid to the role of culture in keeping an empire maintained. Now, the question is, what is the definition of culture as mentioned by Edward Said? According to Badiruddin Omar, the ruler or the imperialist often makes his own culture as a weapon of domination and concentrates for the betterment of that specific culture. This creates cultural backwardness of the colonized. It can be presumed that, I quote, for the progressive and political movements, cultural backwardness of the people and the lack of critical thinking creates obstacles and the ruling class wants to retain that retardation. Unquote. This cultural dominance of the rulers was described by Gramsci as hegemony. We all know that during the colonial times, many journals were published in vernacular and some of them dealt with health related issues. We have seen what kind of articles these health journals used to publish. Now, the question is, who were the readers of the articles on health? If the educated middle class tended to read them, then we can't say these literary efforts were trying to create a massive awareness on public health. In these articles, we have noticed how the authors protested against the government, which were filled with the jark of nationalism. But very few wrote on mass education, which is the essence of keeping good health. Secondly, perhaps the authors did not highlight the necessity to impose firm legal obligations on people to prevent the epidemics in colonial Bengal. Rather, the appeal to the government was moderate, or the writers spent time on self criticisms. It seems like that most of the articles were an example of exhibiting the scholarly attributions, far away to prove its worth from the colonial standpoint. Very few attempts were noticed to address the commoners, and these literary pieces could never be considered as serious endeavors to grab the attention of the government for initiating preventions. The journals like Tattvabodhini Potrika also published articles on health, but those writings did not reflect any plea for imposing public health acts. In the above mentioned journal, mostly we have seen the writings on Ayurveda or some translations from the English works. As for instance, in 1833 AD, Tattvabodhini Potrika published an article on the dental treatment of the elephants by Atoshi Devi. Another article was published describing the goodness of having fruits. It was printed in the year 1834 AD. Now, I would like to mention the excerpts of three selected articles from the health journal Shastro Samachar and will assess their significance. I begin with an article, namely Banglar Shastro Sangbad by an anonymous author. That means the health news of Bengal, who stated, I quote, we don't have any system of our own for registering birth and death rates. Therefore, whatever information we got from the government, we had to rely on it. These information were collected from the rural illiterate policemen or the chowkidars. It is fruitless to argue about the authenticity of these facts. In another article published in the same journal, Dr. M.A. Ansari stated, I quote, we spend 60% of the total revenue for military expenditures, but it would be futile to invest money for protecting the country when the health of the nation is in a nuisance condition. The best remedy to save the country is to solve the health problems of the population. Unquote. The third article was written by Sri Shrish Chandra Goswami. The title of the article is Ghonta Badhibe Ke, Who Will Bell the Cat? He opined that, I quote, the spread of the English education has created a distinction between the literate and illiterate that has to be eradicated. Kindness can reduce the feeling of hatred. Villages are the most peaceful places for dwelling where people get the mental peace or the food for thoughts. The first article which I have chosen criticized the government but did not suggest any solution. The second piece of literature, though mentioned about the health problems of the nation, but how to eradicate those anomalies were not pointed out. In the third article, the author opposed Western education, but he had no answers for how to build a cordial relationship between the literate and illiterate and how the villages could offer food for thoughts. From the above mentioned discussions, one can identify two streams of thoughts or perceptions. Firstly, to highlight the indifference, inefficiency, or the callousness of the British government in the light of the vernacular writings and the governmental documents reports as mentioned in those pieces of writings. Secondly, the failure of the government to have any kind of reforms or to initiate any kind of reforms due to the opposition and unawareness of the indigenous people. It is rare to find the writings, especially on the government and the people. Number one. Secondly, the communication regarding public health between the colonizers and the colonized. Number two. And thirdly, the probable outcomes if there were any. Now, the question is, what was the reaction of the government after seeing the articles published in the health journals like Chikitshok, Shastro Samachar, Chikitshok o Samalochok, and others? The answer is perhaps not known. Secondly, it is needed to have more researches on the writings of Raja Digambar Mitter, Chunilal Bose, and Acharya Prafullo Chandra Ray, and the other stalwarts of public health in colonial Bengal. It is also important to find out the contributions of the Indian officials of the Public Health Department like Otul Chandra Chatterjee, Baman Das Mukherjee to understand the health situation on the eve of independence. Not only that, what were the ideals of the government on sanitation? Why the reports of the sanitary commissioners were important? How far sanitation and epidemics are related? We are supposed to reconsider all these facts. For this purpose, it is obvious to deconstruct the existing theories on the history of public health in colonial Bengal and examine how the government implemented these the social history of colonial Bengal from the lenses of medical literature as words are highly political and the cascade of words is not always anecdotal. The politics of words can decode the social behavior, which is the essence of any kind of historical understanding. Thank you. So, I think I have one question. So, this question is from Aditi Dash. So, I'm just reading it out. I'm very intrigued by this topic. What are some readings that you would suggest regarding medical literature in colonial Bengal to follow up on the same? I mean, any contemporary scholarly works on the same. So, if you would like to have my suggestion, then I would definitely suggest you to go for the primary sources. You try to search for the reports and the official documents on public health. You can get those documents digitally if you go to the digital archives of National Library of Scotland, and also if you search in this space of West Bengal State Archives, then you will be able to get some official documents, the reports of the sanitary commissioners. It's always better to develop your own hypothesis, your own understanding about a particular subject, because the argument of mine is based on this. If you would like to decipher, or if you would like to decode the writings, whatever it's written in a official, in an official report, or in a story, or in a poem which I have mentioned, so you will be able to find out like what happened that time and what were the hidden intentions behind those writings. But if you won't have time for all this, then you can see the books which I think the students or the researchers on public health they know, like the books by Kobita Ray, Aurobindo Shamanto, Mark Harrison, Sujata Mukherjee, and the writings of Projit Bihari Mukherjee, Sanjoy Bhattacharya. I hope these writings will definitely help you to get an idea, but it's always better to go for the primary sources to have your own idea, your own insight. Then you will be able to understand or experience better. Uh, there is one more question. Mm, it's from Meghna Pathak. How far were these medical journals effective in voicing dissent against medical policies of the colonial state? Uh, as I have already mentioned in my paper or my presentation, that these journals they were basically uh, giving emphasis on self criticisms, because most of the writers they either they were writing on why the British government failed to perform uh, any effective duty or duties in regard of public health, or they were criticizing the mass because of their unawareness in regard of public health issues. But what your question is like, and according to my understanding, that I have found that these journals were not that much effective to change the colonial mindset of indifference, or the colonial mindset of to not to have that much involved in public health affairs or to initiate reforms. I think I would like to take one last question, and the other question, uh, yes, we would like to answer it, and uh, please mail this question to me. I request the technical team. So there is one question by Shantanu De. what would you consider? Would you consider that colonies of the British Empire served as experimental laboratories for the development of colonial medical discourses? Yes, it's a very interesting question, sir. So, in my opinion, like definitely the colonies were a place like where the British they got an exposure about the natives, about the different diseases and about the tropical climate, and they got acquainted, or they had a familiarity with the tropical diseases which they never seen, or which they never experienced. So that was definitely made them more aware about the issues related to public health, because they would like to protect or like to save themselves. That's why we saw many acts were initiated by the government just to protect the white men. And if I take the example of how the venereal diseases that time were sporadic, and the first CD acts or the contagious diseases acts were enacted just to protect the white people or the army men. So, but these acts were not that much beneficial for the general public, because those diseases were not that much common for the general public. But when we talk about the epidemics like cholera, malaria, plague, and others, so definitely we find like the British they did some sanitary reforms for the white colonies or for the white towns where they used to live. But the villages or the native towns or the black cities, like if you refer the book by Shukanta Chaudhuri, Calcutta, the Living City, you will be able to get the references about it. So they were not that much vocal or like that much eager to initiate any kind of reform. And definitely the question which you have raised, like experimental laboratories, yes, because Ronald Ross he discovered like how the disease malaria originated. His discovery was made in Calcutta. So definitely what I feel like the British officials as well as the medical practitioners, they were getting more exposures about the diseases, about the geographical and the climatic conditions which made the diseases inevitable, about germ theory, about the theory of miasma. But I think here we can take colonial Bengal or India as a case study. But in different colonies, they faced different problems, they experienced different diseases. So it's better to have an entire discourse based on their experiences, like in the colonies of Africa or of Southeast Asia. Thank you. So I will be definitely giving answer to if any other question is there, and I will ask our technical team to mail me if there is any question. Now we would like to begin our fourth session, and our fourth speaker is Dr. Shrabuni Chatterjee.